Well, let's begin by going to the next slide. The first thing to know is that social insurance is big. Here you have total federal outlays. There are a few zeros missing, but basically it's $3.6 trillion of expenditure. I believe this was 2010. And social insurance listed, Social Security, Medicare, and employment comp adds up to 1.3 trillion. That's 35% of total federal outlays. And as I think most of you in the room know, these numbers are going up. The baby boom's going to be retiring, and therefore both Social Security and Medicare expenditures are going to be rising going forward. Since the topic is government in the 20th century, it might not be too much to say that government in the 20th century will be a pension plan with an army and a few other minor incidental initiatives. I think when people talk about the debt crisis that's sweeping through Europe, and we have certain little debt crises here, we're really talking about the burden of bonds and of debt service on bonds. What's not included is the burden of what are called social insurance entitlements, which is a much more serious fiscal challenge, both here and in Europe. So this thing called social insurance, specifically as it deals with the elderly, is a major fiscal burden, you might call it, on government in the 21st century, and a lot of what government has to do in the 21st century will be sorting out its responsibilities and the burdens that is assumed for these programs. In a nutshell, what is the problem with Social Security? Well, today there are 3 workers for every beneficiary, and by 2030 there will be 2. And that's not a very good ratio. Social Security has a trust fund. It's invested in government bonds these days, and that trust fund will start paying out interest. Matter of fact, this is old information. 2017 was the year when benefits were supposedly greater than taxes. That's today. So that means interest from the bonds has to go to help the trust fund pay benefits. This is maybe 2 years old, these actuarial projections. In 2027, benefits will be greater than taxes plus interest. That's when we start burning the furniture. We start cashing in bonds, and by 2041, and today I think the estimate is 2037, there are no more bonds to sell, and Social Security basically has payroll tax to pay benefits. So Social Security is not exactly going broke, but what it is, it's depleting its trust fund, and at that point, it'll have enough money to pay between 75 and 80 cents on the dollar of benefits. So what can we do? Well, there are only 2 things we can do. We can cut benefits or we can increase revenues. I mean, it's really that simple. If you want to talk about the magic of individual accounts, we can talk about that later, but basically you've got to cut benefits or you've got to raise taxes. And there's some pretty serious constraints. The elderly today are heavily dependent on Social Security. This is the percentage of income that provided by Social Security. And you can see it can get almost to the end of the first tercile of elderly. These are households. And this is a little misleading because a lot of the poor households are single widows. A lot of the richer households are couples. So if you do this by people, it will look a little bit rosier, but this is the way the data comes in. Basically, you can say a third are almost entirely or entirely dependent on Social Security for all of their income. That 2/3 will get at least half of their income from Social Security, and only 1/3 is getting less. So cutting benefits is not such an easy thing to do. And I want you to know that benefits are going down. We're cutting benefits because we're raising the Social Security retirement age. We're cutting benefits because a greater share of benefits are going to be subject to tax. The thresholds are not indexed to anything. So, matter of fact, Social Security is going to rely on those tax revenues as part of the solvency program. Medicaid premiums are going up, which means, and that's taken out of the check before they go out, so you're going to get less cash from Social Security. And something that's rarely noted is that the growth of dual earner families, basically married and working, increases that household's income while that woman is working, but they get very little in return from Social Security because of the so-called spousal benefit, which was a guaranteed benefit. So for all of these reasons, Social Security is going to provide a much smaller share of pre-retirement income going forward than even what we see here in this chart. So cutting benefits is not going to be so easy. Now what about raising taxes? Well, you could raise taxes, but it's important to know these are the payroll taxes and all other federal taxes and credits, again, this is by quintiles. And it's the greatest tax that most households pay until you get to the highest quintile. So we could raise these taxes, but this is already where most of these households get taxed. So we have a bit of a problem. So where did this thing come from? Where did this social insurance, this Social Security thing come from? Well, let's break it out. Social Security is also known as OASDI, which is Old Age Survivor Disability Insurance. So it's for people who are old, it's for their survivors, it's if you're disabled, and let's add unemployment benefits, and Medicare is the other major social insurance program. Now, leaving Medicare aside for a moment, it's a bit of a latecomer. All of these programs insure one thing. Anybody have, what do they insure? What do they insure? If you don't have something, what do they provide? They replace what?
Wages.
Wages. These are all insurance that protect your wages. These are all a creature of the shift in our economy into employment. Basically, these are creatures of the early 20th century when these social insurance plans were created. And it's a function of the fact that we earn our livelihood now no longer by being farmers or small craftsmen, but by going into employment in other enterprises. This move into employment is one of the keys to the great expansion of income and wealth that's been the miracle of the last few hundred years, where normal people like you and me can live a reasonable economic life. We get capital, we get specialization, we get resources and organization, and we go into employment that gives us the ability to make a lot of money and be very productive. The problem is what happens when we don't have employment, because we're too old, because we're disabled, because we're unemployed, or because we die, what happens to our family. That's what social insurance protects. It protects that earnings that people have that they rely on when they don't have it. So let's look at the sequence of events that have created social insurance. The first place where you see things like social insurance is really by big employers, creating what's might called industrial insurance. And they insured workers for the same kinds of things: disability, accident, death, and old age. Why did they do this? A lot of these plans came in, say, when the railroads. Railroads were at the head of a lot of these things. In the 1870s and early 80s. What happened? Well, we had a recession in the 1870s. Management cut wages. The workers got annoyed. They began burning down the rail yards. They began shooting at the Pinkertons, and Pinkertons shooting back. And we had one hell of a blow up in the rail industries of the United States. After things settled down, management went through and began asking, well, what's the problem? What's going on here? Just like we had commissions after the riots of the 60s. What is making people so upset? Turns out that the rail workers were well paid. That was not the problem. The problem was they were insecure. They suffered from, if they died or if they had an accident, their family would be cut off. And the response of the railroad companies was to bring in a whole raft of things that made the life of an industrial worker more secure. That's insurance against unemployment, against accident, against old age, against disability, against death. It's also when they brought in personnel management systems, because up until that time, the foreman was a little tyrant, and he would hire and fire who he wanted, and the life of the worker was really under the thumb of this erratic foreman. So they brought in, you were now hired not by the foreman, but by the personnel department, the grievance procedures, all these things to try to make the life of an industrial worker more stable and rational. And that's where we see these kinds of social insurance, what they call industrial insurance, emerge. Now, of course, everybody didn't work for one of these railroads. A lot of people worked for other kinds of organizations that were not as big, didn't have these kinds of programs. And what happened when they couldn't get income? Well, they were poor, and they fell on welfare. And you've had always tradition of, in human society, we just typically don't let people die on the side of the road. We have welfare institutions. And what you began to see toward the end of the 19th century into the 20th is that you had a lot of old people who couldn't earn a living because they couldn't find employment. When you could have a little cobbler shop, or you were a farmer, it was your shop, you can slow down, you can hire people, but when you had to work for someone else and you couldn't keep up, then you don't have an income. So you had a lot of old people that were without income. And they began to fill up a lot of local welfare roles. And what you saw in Europe, not so much in the United States, were too big and too diverse, is these programs were nationalized. In 1908, England created an old age welfare program, means tested, to help the elderly in England. And you had this in many European countries. So now we have a nationalized welfare system for the elderly. It was means tested. Now, one thing that this created was a large demand on the Treasury. And at that time, very few people could pay tax. In the United States, there was less than 10% of the population paid tax, which was the same in Europe. And rich people said, well, this is getting us to cost a lot of money. Okay, I don't want to pay for this. The problem is, these workers, when they're working, ought to be contributing to their own welfare when they're old. And that's the creation of social insurance. It's really a way to get the poor people, the working people, to pay for their own, in effect, welfare or their own pension when they are old. And that's really where you get social insurance. There are a few countries that avoid that whole welfare parade. One is Germany, because Germany was run by the landowners, and they didn't want to pay for the industrial workers, so they right away went to social insurance, let the workers pay for their benefit. And you didn't have that in the United States, because by 1935, it was clear that these social insurance schemes were really state-of-the-art. So this is where we get social insurance. It comes out of a problem that's an offshoot of the great industrial engine that we create that relies on employment in our productive system. And what you have created in the United States and many other countries, you have a retirement income system that really has two pieces. It has the social security piece, and it also has the employer-defined benefit pension plan piece. So there's a two-part system. And it's important to realize that it is part of our extended social insurance system. Pension plans are subsidized by the government in terms of tax benefits. They're regulated, and they're designed by the regulators and the people who give these subsidies that this should be a broad supplement to Social Security, and that the two pieces together will provide an adequate retirement income for the great majority of the elderly. Now, after World War II, particularly like in the 60s and 70s, we saw a great expansion of these programs. My understanding is this is a time when we had the American boom. Everybody was getting rich. They were moving to Levittown, they were buying cars. Everybody was doing well, but the elderly. Why? Because they weren't earning money. 1959, 1/3 of all the elderly were classified as poor. They were left behind, and what were they going to get? They had Social Security, which at that point was relatively low. So we expanded Social Security. We gave them higher benefits so they could share. Also, so when workers looked forward to their old age, they didn't realize, well, I'm living well now, and then I'm going to go plunge into poverty. So we expanded Social Security. We added Medicare in 1965, and there was a big expansion in employer plans, and in 1994 we enacted the Employee Retirement Income Security Act, which tried to create rules and regulations that would make the defined benefit pension plan a broad-based, reliable source of income for the great majority of the population. And what we have today, if you look at the people who are, I would say 70s or older, you see the fruits of that system. We call it the golden age of retirement. The elderly have never had it so good. They're living generally at roughly what lifestyle that they had when retired, before they worked. And they tend to be fairly happy and well off in retirement. Our challenge is really to see if we can maintain that kind of level of satisfaction, because it's under threat. Now, the two basic changes are the demographic challenge to Social Security, which I mentioned earlier, the fact that there are going to be a lot more retirees than there are to workers than there are today, and that's not going away. That's not just because of the baby boom. That's as far as the eye can see. This is a permanent transition. And then I want to add to our dismal little session here the little analysis of the 401k system. Because as you all know, the 401k has largely replaced the defined benefit pension, and the cohort that's now approaching retirement is going to be largely dependent on retirement savings accumulated in 401ks, 401(b)(3)s, and even the things that are called defined benefit plans. A lot of them are hybrids where you get a lump sum at retirement. And I will say it here, it's a failure, okay? Why do I say it's a failure? This is my thought. It's a failure as a reliable source of retirement income for a broad segment of the population. The tasks of a retirement income system like a 401k, there are others, but let's say you need broad participation in saving. And I think we kind of have that well enough. And with new defaults and automatic enrollment and things like that, we're going to get better. We need reasonable investment decisions. And with defaults in terms of putting into a target date fund and other kinds of default investments, we're going to be doing okay there. But there are two fundamental problems that we haven't solved. One is that in these little individual buckets, which is where we have stocks or equities right now, that's where they are. They're not in Social Security. They shifted from defined benefit plans into these individual accounts. There are waves of finance that sweep over us that are much larger and longer lasting than an individual can navigate. And you're going to have lucky generations and you're going to have unlucky generations. And unless we solve the problem of how we share that experience, there will be unlucky generations that have bad returns as they approach retirement, and they're going to be in trouble. The second problem is this is not a savings plan, this is an income plan. That's what we're doing this for. We're doing all these tax benefits, all this saving, so that we can have an income in retirement, that we can maintain a standard of living that is reasonable. Well, it's a very difficult task to draw an income out of a pile. You can buy annuities, but nobody does that. You can live on the interest and you'll have nothing. You can draw it out and you can run out of money. So what are you going to do? It's a very, very difficult problem. And it's got a lot of risk and we haven't solved it. Now, as it turned out, the first cohort that's going to rely on these things as a source of retirement income, the first cohort dependent on 401ks is us. And what do you know? We're an unlucky generation. You know, maybe if we can go back to, I mean, we had boom years in the 80s and 90s and we lived well. And then we thought, well, we'll have enough resources to maintain that in retirement. And it turned out that we did not have investment returns for over a decade, so we do not have the resources to maintain the lifestyle to which we have become accustomed. And then we don't know how to turn this pile of money into income. So this is the context for which we have to talk about social insurance. Okay, to sum up, the elderly are heavily dependent on Social Security benefits, which are not generous and are declining. The 401k is broken, especially for the boomers about to retire. The payroll taxes are the highest taxes most people pay. And we don't need a little 75-year fix. We need a fix that will last beyond that. If you picked up the Social Security Fix-It book, you'll see that there's some, it's not an insoluble problem, but we have a very difficult problem in terms of making sure we have a reasonably adequate retirement income system going forward in the 21st century. And I'm sure we'll have questions.